need to assess what your commitment level is and what your goals are.
The more you know, you realize that you have more to learn. Have you seen any general change in leadership styles over the course of your career? And if you have, can you describe them?
You have to kind of stay up with what's going on with the current different generations and what their communication style is in terms of how they react and how they engage. The joke is, and there's a great comedian that talks about it, my generation, especially here in the Americas, the latchkey kids. The joke is that, we're raised in an environment kind of like Home Depot, where you think there's people there that can help you, but you're never really sure if they're around, it's not really sure if they can help you, right? Because we're latchkey kids and the parents were, a lot of us had two parents working and we're just kind of on our own trying to figure it out. That's very different than how, a lot of us are raising our children. And because of that, then you need to adapt and change because the approach and what they're used to is very different, and their expectations. So you need to think about those things that, there are generational differences. I kind of laugh that when everybody says, I'm so stressed out, this work is so difficult. And I say, look, I go, work. This isn't work, purely the physics definition of work. So, I have to watch those kind of attitudes when dealing with, different generations of folks for sure.
We tend to apply our own prejudice, biases, insecurities as well on others. So how do leaders do that today, where they impose their way of thinking on current generations? Because I see the current generation so much better than even when I first started working. And I'm like, they talk about mental health, but they know what they're doing better than what I did. So just dive into how leaders can do a better job.
I think that's one where the current generation, I look at my kid and what he's doing and how he interacts and the stupid stuff I was doing when I was his age, they just don't have any interest in it. It's very different. And I think it's very different in a very positive way. They're very attuned with themselves. They tend to, have high expectations of leaders in terms of development. They have high expectations in terms of career development. And my generation tends to be, shut up and get to work. And if you do a good job, then something will happen. And, they're very vocal about doing good work and having high expectations. In the end, that's good. Right? You want people to be vocal about it. Now, you also as a leader need to be prepared for that and being able to have those conversations. Now, if you're a leader that's not comfortable with having conversations about pay, promotion, et cetera, then you'll be challenged and you better start thinking about what you're going to do. And you better be prepared to, reciprocate. And because of their mobility, they are extremely mobile. And if they have good skills, you can lose them real quick. So you need to be prepared for that. If the traditional salary ramp at your company is very slow, right? As a leader, you need to think about how to use the salary system to accelerate them as quickly as possible so that you keep them around. Otherwise, if you just play the normal game, you'll lose. If you know that your company isn't going to be able to keep them around, then your job as a leader is to give them as many varied experiences as possible so that they can they can really exceed in their next career choice. As a leader, that's what, the people are working for you. You need to do that for them.
This generation is much more comfortable with change and they're much more dynamic. I think the older generations were not as comfortable with change and they would rather stay in a situation and try to make it work.
When they do see a leader is absent, the leader is not going deep and not finding out what's beneath the surface of the iceberg, how do they approach it? How do they become the leader they wish they had?
I think the number one thing is when I talk about leadership, there's always direct line in an org chart, Leadership isn't necessarily that, right? You can be a leader in your team in terms of how you engage and lead your team. In American football, you'll see this little thing on different players' shoulders that'll have a C, and that means they're one of the team captains. And you'll see that C with, like 4 dots means they're the captain of that side, the offense or defense or whatever. It's the person who steps up and really leads the team and gets the team focused and unofficially, if people are slacking off, calls them out. Leadership is an intrinsic skill that we all have in every job that we have. The question is, what do you do? The most effective leaders often have been people in the organization that get the most rest of the team listens to.
to think about why the leader is struggling. It could be either arrogance or ignorance. I think they need to understand why it's happening and have that understanding and clarity to think about it unemotionally, and then to address it. The conversations that they need to have need to be devoid of emotion, very factual, and sort of methodically think about how they can address the situation and have a vision which is not just about them, but about like a wider vision.
If you start using the word I, that's usually meaning you're not being a leader.
Do you believe that frustrations and challenges in the workplace are often symptomatic of underlying issues, the base of the iceberg, that are not being addressed? How can leadership address, with the iceberg principle in mind, one key frustration that most tech professionals face?
But according to the iceberg principle, I can't answer that question without trying to learn more.
And I always found it that people never dove deep and went slow to just work together to figure things out.
And my approach is different than most people's approach, because I have enough confidence in myself where if that is going to be direct and honest is going to be a challenge, and I will set up those meetings and say, look, I'm going to be honest about this. I've been in meetings where, especially meetings with, a bunch of different people from a bunch of different organizations, and I call them the gotta look smart meetings, where you'll have somebody in an organization that has no idea what you're doing, and you show something that's red, and then they gotta look smart and start asking questions, even though they have no background or no real understanding. So then you start spending time talking about that, and then you're just basically educating them, and then everybody goes, and then the meeting goes. So if it's that kind of format, I always took a little latitude. Now, if it's truly a meaningful meeting, where there's going to be meaningful in-depth discussion or understanding of what it is, where we're making investments, if dollars and cents and people and performance, I always straight up, and then I will walk. So like, this is red and this is wall, and have the personal integrity to do that.
So you being a leader, when you're presented a dashboard, you see a red, green, yellow, or red, yellow. What are some of the things that you say in order to look beneath the surface? What's your language?
So if it's someone presenting it to me in my organization that they have a red, I would say, okay, tell me a little more about that. What can I do to help? What have you tried? That's it. Pretty straightforward. And the other thing is, it just cuts to the chase. It makes everything much more efficient, right? And not to feel robotic about it, but there's some meetings where it's really important that you connect personally and get caught up. And there's some meetings where you just got to get through. You got to get through and understand where we're at organizationally, so you can fit all those pieces together, figure out what you're doing, and then move forward. I think that approach is pretty healthy. I wish people would do that more. It seems very simple, but we end up in these either creative writing or creative dialogue sessions.
I feel like the communication that doesn't happen on the different levels of management is because of the lack of safety, and things do not move up because engineers or whatever level of management doesn't feel safe enough to communicate that. So from the top level, he creates that environment of safety, and that allows him to dig deeper into the iceberg. But from the bottom up, if you're an engineer and you don't feel safe communicating to your manager, what is your advice for somebody like that to flip that environment of feeling unsafe?
My advice is take the risk. You're an engineer. You're a very, very valued asset. My advice is just be direct and honest and take that risk. And a lot of engineers don't. They don't want to admit if they're being challenged because there's something that they're struggling with. I always loved reading self-assessments from people, because it really shows their maturity and honesty. If you read a self-assessment for somebody that looks like a glowing report card, okay, it shows they're pretty immature in terms of how they approach those things, right? Don't be a victim. It's at will both ways. You got to remember that. So the last thing you want to do is not value yourself and not value your own integrity. That's the worst thing that you could do, in my opinion. We're starting to hire, people that all they've known is a phone without buttons, right? They have no idea what a landline is or a CD or, it's a different world these days. And, that's, again, we talked about it earlier. A leader, don't get stuck in what your past often is a good resource to have and to kind of dig into it. But sometimes it can also be an anchor. You got to be self-aware enough to understand that.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and see you in our next podcast next month.